All right. Next episode. Here we are. I'm going to make it seem like we were just seeing each other first time in days,
Hello.
but we're now into the book of Obadiah in our study entitled The Character of God as, or just no as, The Character of God Revealed in the Minor Prophets. Mm-hmm. And today we are coming to the book of Obadiah, which we're just doing some confirmation. We wanted to make sure we were right. Obadiah is, in fact, the
shortest book in the Old Testament.
Old Testament.
One of the shortest books in Scripture.
Only shortest to 2 John.
I think so, yeah.
But we did by word count.
Word count.
But this is only 21 verses, so we were kind of joking beforehand. This episode is going to be about 5 minutes long. We could actually read. See. We could actually read the whole book to you.
We could. It would be really fun, like a bedtime story, but not a fun one.
Not a fun one, right? Let me give you some of the facts here about Obadiah. Believe it or not, we don't know a lot about Obadiah himself.
Nope.
But this we've circled the date about 570 BC. Now, this is an interesting book here because I think this is the first one to this point in our study, and we're going in order. We're going in the way that it is laid out for us in the Scriptures. This is the first one of the minor prophets that we get to that is not directed to either the north or the south specifically. This is directed to Edom, which is a neighboring nation to Israel. And again, but we can say there are familial ties here, which is an interesting component of all this.
Tell us a little bit about where the people of Edom come from.
Yeah,
I think this is so interesting.
I know, this is a little factoid that you might not otherwise pick up. So you have in the Old Testament the accounts of Jacob and Esau. All right, now the descendants of Jacob.
And Esau is the one who sold his birthright.
Esau sold his. There was always this conflict between Jacob and Esau. And matter of fact, if you're doing a daily Bible reading plan, you might even be on that section right about now. Where you see this division or this conflict between Jacob and Esau. So the descendants of Jacob, we can say...
the children of Rebekah and Isaac.
Yes.
Who are Isaac, the son of Abraham. So that's where we are, sort of in the lineage.
And Jacob eventually becomes Israel, whereas Esau becomes...
Edom.
Named after, that's why we said that the Edomites. And so this is a message from Obadiah directed to the people of Edom. And again, so it's not northern kingdom, southern kingdom, but the neighboring nations here. And so the problem here was that this Edom, the neighboring nation, after this Jerusalem's fall to Babylon, that's in the southern kingdom, the Edomites plundered the land and committed violence against these captives instead of having mercy on them.
Right.
And so what's the message of Obadiah? It's again short book of the Bible here, but there's a sort of two distinct messages in it. The first one, the first half is directed toward the people of Edom, and it's a strict warning for them against any violence that they're taking and against Judah. And the second half of Obadiah is a message or a word of hope for this wearied people, how they can look forward to a day when God's kingdom will include not just Judah, but all nations. And so that's kind of the purpose and occasion.
So, Lee Eric, pastorally, let me ask you a question, because this is a super short book. It's not directed to the Israelites at the beginning for most of it. But it's part of the canon of Scripture. Why study a book like this?
Yeah, why study a book like this? That's a good question because, again, just like we were talking in last week's message, it's still a prophet always had to validate their calling. They always had to detail as what makes them worthy of saying the words, "Thus saith the Lord." And when they say, "Thus saith the Lord," it should pique our attention, whether or not it's directly pointed at us, whether it's directly pointed at Northern Kingdom, Southern Kingdom, in this case, Edom. Because here's the fact: is that we're all dreadful sinners. We all have Edomite tendencies, and so thankfully this is included in the canon, and even 21 short verses we get to glean from the wisdom that we find in it.
Well, and I think it helps us understand even more the breadth of God's mercy, right? The New Testament so many times reminds us that Jesus came not just for the Jews, but also for the Gentiles. He came not just for the Israelites, he came for the Edomites and the Ammonites and the Philistines and all of Israel's enemies. And we see throughout the New Testament, them citing books like Obadiah, referencing books of the minor prophets, to remind us that God's kingdom, the saving grace of Jesus, is not limited to the original Israelites, right? There's a width to it. Like, if you believe in Jesus, you can be a part of the kingdom.
Yep.
So it helps us understand God's mercy even more.
Yeah, and again, we've repeated so many times throughout this series is that with divine judgment comes divine mercy, and so this message of divine judgment against the nations, be they northern, southern, or outside of that, there is judgment for the nations.
Yeah.
But there's also mercy for the nations too, and a story of redemption. So let's break this book in two. This interesting outline here. We can say the first half directed toward the Edomites, second half toward all nations. But there's a pivotal verse right in the middle where it all kind of hinges on that verse 15. So Obadiah will say verses 1 through 14. This is the warning to the leaders of Edom. The Edomites were full of pride. They said to themselves, this is Obadiah 1, 3-4, we live in the heights at home with the stars. Who can bring us down? Gosh. Just listen to the dripping, prideful comments of the Edomite leaders. Again, it's pride that led the Edomites to not just stand idly by when Babylon came to destroy, but then they actually participated in the pillaging and the plundering and took advantage of them. So,
and if we look at if we're in, there's a thing that happens moving into verses 10 through 14, and that is it's really satirical.
Yeah.
And so one of the really interesting literary features of the minor prophets is so often they use satire, which we don't always think of the Bible as like a book that is witty or funny, but particularly like when we get to Malachi is, the wit is so sharp.
Yeah.
But Obadiah does that too. And so in verses 10 through 14, what we see is Obadiah using satire to say, don't do these things, even though he knows they've done them.
Right.
They're all things that have happened. He's not telling them, hey, do not enter the gate of my people and do not gloat over his disaster. Like, he's saying, you already did that.
You're done. Yeah. You've done this.
You've done this.
And all that satirical talk leads us to verse 15. And verse 15, of course, says, for the day of the Lord is near upon all the nations.
I feel like we need a little bell every time we say day of the Lord.
I know.
In one of these podcasts.
How often is it repeated here? And then it goes on to say, as you have done, it shall be done to you. Your deed shall return on your own head. Ouch. That's pretty steep. This sudden shift goes from Edom to all nations. Why did that happen? Again, this verse is sort of a hinge piece linking the first half to the second half of the book, and he announces this day of the Lord, not just for the Edomites, but for all nations. Obadiah says that all the nations who act like Edom will face God's judgment. And so, again, we talk about this idea of pride goes before the fall. Again, whether or not we're talking about Edom, all nations, or whatever, this is the consequence of pride.
Which it does. This is where Obadiah links to what we talked about last week in Amos. This idea of pride, this idea like the Lord will bring his people and not his people to justice. God cannot deny there are these like his justice or his mercy. Like they are two sides of the Lord that are equal and both happen. And that's why we get Jesus, right? Because God's justice cannot be denied, and neither can his mercy, and so he sends his son to fulfill those things.
That's right. And so again, this hinge piece of a verse goes. All it does, and again, this is true for all nations. It's true for us. But Edom's behavior, again, this is very typical of all nations that do the same thing, deserve justice. So it's emblematic of sorts. And then we get this pivot to Obadiah 1:16-21, where, again, it's almost like we're a broken record. But every time we read about God's justice, it's always accompanied by
hope.
His hope and mercy.
Yep.
That's it.
There is a formula to these minor prophets, and it is in a lot of ways, it's the formula of all of Scripture.
That's right.
Fall, redemption, restoration.
It's the same story over and over again.
Story.
And somehow we have trouble processing it all. But again, the hope that you find there is that God's judgment is never his final word. And we can even go back and look at the conclusions of Joel and Amos. And Joel had this picture of what happens after the day of the Lord and judgment against all nations. He said he'd perform a new act of salvation in Jerusalem, and those that humbled themselves would be delivered. Amos said that after the day of the Lord had judged Israel's evil, God would one day raise up that house of David and build it up a new kingdom of Israel that would include Edom and all the nations that bear my name. That's in Amos 9:12. And so it's really interesting, and I'm not the first one to notice this. I read it in a couple of different places, that the book of Obadiah has been placed right after Joel and Amos, very intentionally, to sort of expand upon these promises about God and the hope of God's kingdom over all the nations, and this wonderful act of restoration that will take place. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense. Like, again, it's a really short book, but when you take it as part of the whole canon of the minor prophets, it builds on these same themes. Yeah, I think that's great.
And so finally, the little book of Obadiah, it concludes. But again, like Melanie's talking about, it does sort of paint this larger picture of God's justice and faithfulness that we find in all the prophets. The sort of the ancient pride and betrayal of the people of Edom that is emblematic. It's symbolic of the human condition and the ways which again we betray and hurt each other as and God's character. We make an assault on it. But again, there's still hope. There always is hope in these books, as Edom's downfall points to the day when God will deal with evil in our world and bring his kingdom of peace over to all nations.
Gosh, it's the hope we need, right?
It's the hope we need. And again, we could read this book over and over and over again. And
it wouldn't take you very long.
It wouldn't take you very long, but you'd get a sense of what the overarching narrative of Scripture.
Yeah.
It's all tight here in 21 verses. And, well, gosh.
That's why we love the minor prophets.
That's right.
I hope you guys are enjoying going through them as much as we are.
And again, this was maybe a minor episode because, again, we just got with what they
but
gave
we'll
us.
make up for it next week. Next week's Jonah. So we're going to have so much fun.
So that's what you have to look forward to is the book of Jonah, which, again, that one's packed full of...
It's so good.
It's so good. It's one of the most surprising books to me, and we'll get to that when we study the book of Jonah. Yep. So thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.